Hi folks, welcome to Code and Concrete, where we share the latest trends and the stories of trailblazers in the built environment. We hope you gain some insight from our wide range of topics such as real estate development and sustainability, or blockchain, artificial intelligence, and data. Joining us today is Ralph Montague. He's an architect, BIM consultant, an educator, a coordinator of construction industry BIM groups, an agent for change. It's interesting. Hope we get into that, what that means. The co-founder of ArcDox, the co-founder of the BIM Coordinators Summit, and the BIM Heroes community. Lots of co-founding there. Ralph, I'm very excited to have you on. Thanks for joining us today.
Great to be here, Matthew. Really looking forward to talking about my favorite subject, which is buildings, and great work that you're doing in building as well. So I'm sure it's going to be a great discussion.
Conveniently named. I'm glad that you love buildings, and hopefully you love Building Inc. just as much.
Yeah. I love the name of the podcast as well, because I like the interplay of code and concrete, because it's the information and the physical reality. I mean, that's what architecture is all about. Yeah, so
it's a dynamic
great name.
Yeah. And of course, we've got the alliteration there. I wanted to, whatever I named it, I wanted the letters to start or words to start with the same letters. So I think it's well fitting. Glad you like it. That to me, branding is a whole lot, and I think we're starting to see that become a little bit more prominent in BIM. I have seen like LinkedIn pages, of course, what you're doing with BIM Heroes. That's branding in and of itself, and ArcDox, just to talk about these concepts and get them out there and make them appealing and attractive.
Yeah. And the word code is such an interesting word because it has so many meanings. I mean, you probably were thinking about computer code or digital code when you thought of the name, but in our industry, there's code could be anything. It could be like the building regulations code, or the planning code, or the environmental code that, because we've got a regulated industry, and health and safety code. So code is such a rich word that talks to compliance and all sorts of things besides computer code.
Yeah, well, it's a great point. And right away where my mind went is the attributes of a word, right? The metadata of something like the word code. You have the literal meaning. And this reminds me of a post that you had on BIM Heroes where you've got the document itself, but then you have attributes, you have interpretation of information where it's like, why was this chosen? What is the context surrounding this? And you do a really good job of that, of taking something literal, which in this case could be a building and assets, and then asking the bigger question, like, what don't we see that needs to be thought about and considered, and what value exists there? You do a very good job of that. That's the premise of our conversation today, too.
Yeah, well, I suppose as an architect, I mean, that's really our business, because as an architect, you bring the idea into reality. So you're bringing something intangible into a physical reality through design and through project management and compliance with all these codes and regulations. And so it's that relationship between the intangible and tangible is pretty much what our profession is involved in. And it's something I've been doing for 30 years. So it's something I'm passionate about.
So passionate about it for 30 years. Well, let's turn back the clock then. So 30 years ago, you were just getting into this. I mean, was this something that you picked up in high school? Was it a family member? How does the Ralph story start?
The Ralph story is, well, I've always had an interest in design and and making things. So I'm always interested in how things work and how things get made, which is probably to my family's detriment. When I was really young, I used to break apart things to figure out how they worked. Which I remember in one time I stripped my dad's camera, which he wasn't very excited about. But yeah, it's so creativity, understanding how things work and how things are put together. I suppose through a series of events led me to study architecture and 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 then get into the field of architecture. And yeah, but at the time when I graduated, we were still working on drawing boards and using pens and paper, and CAD was just becoming a thing. Yeah, so it's showing my age, but it's always been fascinating to me that we're still doing the same thing 30 years later. And that is we're communicating information about ideas that bring physical things into being, like buildings or infrastructure. And so what we're doing isn't different. The way we're doing it is completely different. The technologies we're using are completely different, and those are forever changing and changing at a much quicker pace as life goes on. But it's still this process, bringing something out of nothing, uh, which is fascinating.
It's a powerful thing to take, in this example, an idea, and then you're transmuting that idea to paper where other people can see it, or hopefully the computer, if we're going to
Yeah,
talk about productivity in design and construction, and then actually following through on that. So
yeah, yeah.
you studied architecture, and then what was your first job? Was it related to that?
Yeah, I worked as an architect. So I worked as an architect for 15 years. First in South Africa. So I was born in South Africa, studied in South Africa, um, graduated in South Africa, and eventually we moved to Ireland about 24 years ago. Carried on working as an architect, an associate at one of the biggest practices in Ireland, and then we started getting into BIM, or building information modeling, where we were using better technologies to describe buildings, and I suppose we just saw that this was going to be a thing. People were going to move away from analog communication devices and move to more digital communication devices. And so decided 15 years ago to specialize in that area of communication. And so in a way, stepped back from traditional architecture and design and got more involved in the working with clients and other architects and engineers and contractors to understand these processes and technologies. And they're not just technologies. I suppose that's important. It's the combination of processes and technologies. So that's what we've been doing for the last 15 years, uh, helping the the industry on this transition, because there's a digital transition of our industry.
So if we were to put you in your normal shoes of BIM consultants, and I was a real estate developer, and I wasn't familiar with BIM, how would you break this down to me? Because there's the technological component, but then there's also the process. How would you describe that to me?
Well, if you're a real estate developer that has developed something before, it's quite easy, because I would just remind you of all the trouble that you've had in your previous projects, where communication of information has led to delays and budget overruns and all sorts of compliance issues, and you so the experience of people operating in this sector is quite difficult because of poor communication of information and poor access to information. So, and that's all because most of the information is either analog, produced in a very substandard way, and communicated in very difficult means. There's no standardized or centralized communication of information. There's emails here and boxes of paper there, and it's so you would immediately be reminded, and cold shivers would come over you. Um, and then I would say that there's a better way of communicating, and that's through digital processes and technologies. So if we can streamline the processes and use better technologies, we can improve communications, and that ultimately will reduce friction. It will reduce the delays. It will reduce the variations and problems you have. Ultimately, it will reduce the cost. It will improve the quality, and so things would get better for you. And so hopefully that would spark some interest to take a deeper look into what we're talking about. So I don't know if you weren't a developer, if you were like a first time developer, you would probably imagine that the industry is very digitized anyway. Because if you think of the rest of your life, the way you order things online, or the way you travel, the way you do everything in a digital manner. So you would probably expect that the AEC sector, the broader architectural engineering, construction, real estate, and infrastructure sector, that sort of sector that's involved with the built environment, you would probably think that they fairly advanced and digitized. But unfortunately, that's not the case. It's probably one of the least digitized sectors.
And why is that? Why is it the least digitized?
Well, it's probably a few reasons, but one is it's quite fragmented, so nobody has like a central responsibility. If, let's say you're a manufacturer like, which over in the United States, you have, is it GM Motors or something? When you're a manufacturer, you have control over the whole process and the whole supply chain. But in the property sector, that control isn't centralized. It's fragmented. So people are only focused on a very short piece of work for a very short period of time. So, give an example: an architect might be involved in the design of a building for maybe a year or two. Yeah, a contractor might be involved in the construction of a building for maybe 3 years. Somebody has to maintain and operate that building for maybe in periods of 5 years, but those contracts also change. So if you had to look for somebody who's got the overview from beginning to end, it's very difficult to find that person, who has an interest in streamlining the end-to-end process. And that would be different in, say, manufacturing. They have a definite interest in streamlining the end-to-end process. So that's probably one of the reasons, is the fragmentation. And then, of course, there's a lot of traditional thinking. People grew up with very hands-on manual trade labor. They sort of think, well, why do I need digital information to do my job? I've always been able to do it without it. So, yeah, why change?
So the lack of ownership, responsibility, seems to be a primary driver. In that case, who should be responsible?
Well, that's a very difficult question, because let's say you're a property developer, your interest is very short-lived as well, because maybe you're trying to develop a property and sell it on. So your focus is really just on that early stage of trying to take the value of a property and elevate it and sell it on. And what happens after that, you're really not interested in. And if you're passing on a lot of problems to the future owner, that's also really not your problem. Yeah. So,
right.
So it depends who you're talking to. Of course, there's instances where maybe an owner occupier will develop a property for their own use for the long term, and then they have a more vested interest in the broader performance across all those stages. But there's no one size fits all, because each use case is different. But I think things are changing, so regulations are helping that. for instance, it's becoming more difficult to sell a substandard property into the market because whatever you're trying to sell has to comply with certain standards or regulations, and those are being enforced in better ways than they were before. But it's a slow process.
So regulation is one possible solution to encourage compliance, productive, and premium handover. What do you think about influence of the market as well? Because if I were to see into the future and properties are becoming more transparent and there becomes a greater gap between assets that have contingency and are discounted and those that are sufficiently maintained, developed with best practices, do you think that that's going to influence and encourage stakeholders?
I think as people become more educated on the value of or what gives a property a value. So I mean, I'm trying to think of an example, but if you looked at two buildings side by side, they could be in the same neighborhood, they could be of similar square footage, etc. But one building, you didn't know much about it. Like I said, you didn't know the quality of the materials that were used and how long they would last, or the equipment that was installed. Was it going to last another 5 years, or was it going to have to be replaced in 2 months' time? You had very little background information, and the building next door, you had full transparency. So you know exactly what materials were used, how long they would last, what warranty still existed on the materials, how often the equipment has been serviced, like a service history, when they were due to be serviced again or replaced, etc. Some people would look at those two buildings, and the more intelligent ones would probably put a higher value on the one that you knew more about, and the others would discount fully, significantly discount the other one because they're buying into the unknown. I mean, the whole building could be, not be able to be occupied in 2 months' time because all the equipment has packed up. So I think as people become more intelligent and educated on what gives properties their value, it's not just location, but it's also quality of materials, quality of workmanship, information about the components of the buildings, be those physical components like the materials or the pieces of equipment and the service history, etc. And a sort of transparency in the general upkeep and operations of that building compared to something you knew very little about, then that will definitely affect the market price of those two properties. Of course, you still get speculative buyers who would still buy the cheap one, hoping it would survive and be able to be sold on before anything materialized. But that is speculative. Yeah.
Well, the intelligence component is interesting, and that word can be interpreted a couple ways. But if we look at how humans are set apart, it's that frontal lobe, it's that prediction of the future. And so to me, if we look at intelligence that way, you would want as much insight into the future as possible, and you only obtain that with all these attributes, this metaphysical asset, this information of the asset that exists alongside the asset. I mean, to me, this makes a lot of sense, and I've been talking about it a lot lately, and it has been inspired by you. As a thought leader here.
It does make sense, although you could say that predominantly the market operates in a very cloudy environment. So, for the most part, existing property assets have very poor or very limited information available. So, and yet people still operate.
Right.
So, and you could say that's part of being human being is you can operate in a world that's unknown. Like you're able to move forward without knowing everything, and that's great. But absolutely, as you said, the more you know, the better you can navigate, and the better you can avoid pitfalls. And so some people are really just taking a chance. You buy a property, you don't know what you're buying. It could fall down next week. It could survive another 10 years, but you just take a chance. And for the most part, the sector operates in that cloudy gray area. And but I think the more informed and the more educated investors are beginning to realize, well, we're in the digital age of information and knowledge. Surely we can access better information, we can make better predictions and better analysis, and we can optimize performance of our assets. And so the better ones are seeking to gather more information and use these tools that are available to them for analysis and performance prediction, etc. And so yeah, I don't know if there's going to be a two-tier market that could happen, or if eventually somebody with an asset that has very limited information will find it increasingly difficult to either rent that or sell it.
If I were to make a prediction, I think that's what's going to happen. There's going to become a base expectation for what an asset possesses beyond its physicality, its physical existence, and
Yeah,
that'll become normal in the market.
yeah. I mean, people. That's because my interest is in information, obviously, as a expert in information management. But one of the interesting things is that people really appreciate the physical. So when they see a building, see a piece of infrastructure, yeah, they get the physical value of that thing. But very few people think about, firstly, how did that thing come into being? Like, it didn't just materialize. Somebody had to produce some information, some instructions, to that resulted in some tasks that got that thing to be constructed. So there's some base information about the materials that were used, the procedures that were used that would be useful. And then other people don't really appreciate that when you have to do anything, say you have a building and you have to service the boiler, you have to service the air conditioning system, you also need information, because it's difficult to go and service something that you know nothing about. You'd have to send somebody to site, get them to do an inspection, come back to the office and prepare the work. So you're double handling everything. So so I think the appreciation of as you said, the unknown piece, the information piece is growing, but it's probably not fully appreciated yet. But there's no doubt in my mind anyway that information has value. It adds value to something. Going back to my example of the two buildings, if you're buying a building with information and a building without information, definitely the one with information must have more value, all things considered. And so the information has value. And I suppose our particular interest is in how to secure that value through digital technologies, so that the information doesn't get lost, doesn't get corrupted, it doesn't become inaccessible. That it's available to people when they need it. Sometimes I use the example of I don't know if you know about the Grenfell fire disaster in the UK, but it was a tall building about 4 years ago where 70 people died. It was a massive fire, and it took the emergency services, the fire brigade, 24 hours to find the gas stop-off valve. Now, in that moment, that information about where the gas stop valve was life critical to
Mhm.
70 people, but it just couldn't be found. Yeah. And so sometimes people say, well, I'm not sure people will need this information. Why bother? But you don't know. When you need it,
Right.
then it becomes critical. So I think you should always assume that information has importance, and that it should be protected, like any asset. I mean, you wouldn't buy a car and not service it, yeah, because you want the car to keep running, and when you sell the car, you want it to have a service history. So you are protecting the value of the asset, which is the car, by looking after it. So if you make the assumption that information is an asset and it has value, then you should do the same thing with information. You should have some process that looks after the information over time.
I think it begs the questions, though, how do we calculate and realize that value? In my mind, I would say you would first have to break it down into the individual stages of a property. And if value or information increases productivity, which would shorten timelines and ensure that you don't go over budget, then there's a measurable value. And then doing that at different stages. But, to you, how do you think we'll start to calculate and realize that value, especially at scale, selling a property for a premium where it's a percentage? How do we calculate this and make it consistent and predictable, especially in finance and banking?
Yeah, that is a difficult question because, going back to the example of finding the gas stop-off valve, like how valuable is that information to the 70 people who lost their lives? It's of extreme value. I think any of those 70 people probably would have considered it really important. But I mean, there's been numerous studies throughout the years. One that comes to mind is one that the Boston Consulting Group did for the World Economic Forum. I think it was back in 2016, but they basically contrasted an analog process to a digital process, and they estimated about 13 to 20% saving in the design construction phase of assets. So that's sort of short capital investment stage, and then a 10 to 20% saving each year on the operations of an asset through having a digital process versus a more traditional analog process. So I mean, I suppose that's a significant saving. Yeah, if you could say your operational cost of a building or an asset, 10% of that could be saved each year by having access to a digital resource of information versus a haphazard source of information in boxes and lever arch files and or even non-existent, which is probably mostly the case. So now I don't know. Is that interesting to people? That's difficult to say because I'm not in the real estate business, so I don't know if that's an interesting number, but certainly sounds interesting to me.
Well, in an economic environment like this, even a few basis points can make a big difference. And then, when it comes down to information, determining if the information itself is interesting enough to collect and hold on to, I think if it's simple enough to collect the information, right? And this is where IoT and artificial intelligence come into play, where we might have millions of data points that a person would not, really want to go out and gather, but we can start to collect those and it's fed automatically. If we think about sensors determining the health of a very minute component, you could have someone check on that, open a hatch and say, yeah, that looks good to me. Or it's just automatically reported. And it's sort of like, tire pressure on a car. We like the car analogy here. It doesn't really matter what that tire pressure is. You could poke it with your thumb or something like that. But until you're on the freeway and you get an indicator that something's going wrong, and then suddenly you realize, oh, well, I'm glad that this overlooked thing was collected. But
Yeah.
it's that computer doing it automatically for you, so it no longer feels like a burden. How do you see AI and IoT playing into the information mix or BIM in general?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I suppose that's the holy grail that everybody's talking about, in this idea of a digital twin, so that every physical asset would have a digital version of itself, and the two would speak to each other. So, like the example you used there of the tire pressure, yeah, the sensor is speaking back to your digital dashboard, um, and that's allowing you to make some decision about whether to continue driving or to stop, or to check something. So, I mean, that's not a new idea. That's an idea that's been around for a long time in manufacturing anyway. This idea of a digital twin, and the value that brings to all phases. In fact, the design, the construction, the operations, even the long-term decommissioning of assets, and the recycling of materials, or the repurposing of building structures for other purposes, rather than sort of destroying buildings completely. Maybe there's potential to create a sort of circular economy. So there's lots of use cases of value that information will bring at different stages. But it comes back to the problem. Well, who's it bringing value for, and who's paying for it? Like, because if you're a developer building a building now, and you plan to sell it in 2 years' time, then you really don't care about ideas of digital twins and future performance operations, because you see that as somebody else's problem. So
Mm-hmm.
there's a real diffusion of responsibility challenge in our sector. Um, yeah, that's a real thing. I mean, I don't know if you've heard the story of Kitty Gervais in New York. I think it was in the 1960s, but there was a woman that was murdered in Queens, in New York, in front of her apartment, and 38 people witnessed the murder, but nobody did anything because everybody assumed somebody else would do something.
Mm.
So, and that's kind of happening in our industry because of the fragmentation. Everybody assumes somebody else's problem, but actually it's all of our problem. Like, we all have a part to play, whatever little part you play. If you're an architect and you only have this 2-year window that you're engaging with the property, but that part that you play in the overall game is incredibly important. So I don't have the answer, I suppose, to to tie it together. I think the answer is coming from regulation. So following that disaster I spoke about in the UK with the fire, it sparked a whole sort of look at the regulations around information and safety controls in the building sector in the UK, and they've sort of developed this idea of the golden thread, so that there should be information that flows from party to party throughout the life cycle of physical assets, be they buildings or infrastructure. And yeah, that information shouldn't be lost or disregarded, but it should be continued. It should have a life. They've called it the golden thread, but the idea is that no matter where you come into the game, let's say as a property investor, you're coming in 3-4 years into the life of a property, you should have access to the information resource and the history, of that asset, to make your decisions, and also to assist you in the optimization of what you do with that property for the next wherever long you have it. So, um, and that's being regulated. So I think that once it's a regulation, and people could go to jail, I think that will probably motivate people.
How do you see the relationship between that golden thread and blockchains or decentralized ledgers?
Yeah, that, as you know, our community is very interested in that because the, the way our sector is structured as a very fragmented structure, it suits a distributed ledger, if you like, of information. Yeah, if you if you're Volkswagen or General Motors and you control the whole supply chain, then having everything on one server is fine. But when you're in this sector and you have all these different players making inputs and at different times, having some controlled, decentralized resource of information that is immutable is a really fascinating idea because it's not dependent on any one organization to maintain and keep that. And if there's a dispute later, you can't go to the server and sort of tamper with the information to change the narrative. Yeah, so um, I think it's a fascinating idea. Of course, it doesn't suit everybody. So I mean, I think it's fair to say we have a fair amount of corruption in our industry, as most industries, and some people like to have control of the information and to massage and manipulate the information to form their own narrative.
Hmm.
And blockchain and distributed ledgers don't really allow you to do that. So,
Right.
so you could say there's definitely an element of the community of the industry that prefer to hold on to control.
Mm-hmm.
But I see that's the way it's going. I mean, as people begin to understand the value of, of blockchain as a ledger of information rather than a currency or anything. I think when most people think about blockchain, they're just thinking of cryptocurrencies and that they're not thinking of it as a immutable record of the historic transactions of information, and I think that's probably more interesting in our sector. When you buy a property, you have an immutable record of the historic development of everything related to that property available to you to perform analysis or perform computational optimization of your process or anything. So it's a really fascinating idea, and I can't see why it wouldn't go that way, despite all the players who would prefer not to see that.
Right. Let's touch on that. So,
but you can see it in the crypto world, can't you? Like for so many years, the traditional banking systems have opposed this idea of digital currencies, but now like it's pushed through, and now everyone's getting on board. And if you're a banker and you're not thinking about it, then you're probably on your way out of business.
So in real estate broadly, who is hesitant? Who's pushing back? Who doesn't want to see this implemented? Because you talked about information corruption. What are examples of that? How prevalent is it?
Well, if you let's I'll just take construction for instance. So if let's say a contractor wins a contract to build a $100 million project, he's got to subdivide that work into subcontracts. He'd probably prefer that the subcontractors don't know the full story of what they're earning, so that they can sell the work on at a discounted price, and then it goes down the chain. So a subcontractor wins a portion of the work, and then they try and get somebody else to do pieces of it, but they don't want them to know everything. So everybody's kind of wanting to keep the information close to their chest so that they can manipulate the market. And in that instance, transparency is not their friend, because they can't play that manipulation game. So I think that's probably very prevalent. People are just trying to make it's like arbitrage. They're trying to manipulate the difference between of understanding of what I understand about this and what you understand about this. If I have more information than you do, I can manipulate our transaction. But in an open, transparent information idea, then that would be very difficult, and we would actually have to do real business and be honest with each other.
Right.
So I don't know what the level is. So it's bigger than we think.
I've seen some numbers. If we look at contractual disputes, there was a figure that came out of Hong Kong recently, and I know about it because there was a company that said, "Oh, let's start anchoring these contracts to the blockchain. It'll help reduce counterparty risk," because you have parties that are manipulating or conflating the amount of work done and the payment associated with that. You owe us, no, you didn't do the work, or it was supposed to be delegated to someone else. And so I think that's a really good practical application of smart contracts, because right now smart contracts are such a big misnomer where they're not smart, they're not contracts. But in this example, you're talking about real tangible contracts between parties, and they would actually be able to operate peer-to-peer with that level of trust. Right now, if you operate peer-to-peer, you're introducing risk, and then you might have to bring in an intermediary, which is a court, to settle that dispute. But if it's something that, hey, this is the proof, and money moves automatically based off of the job, there's potentially millions, if not billions of dollars that, from what I've heard, is owed to people that could be resolved.
Yeah. I mean, if you think of our industry, there's very deep supply chains. And so you'd have the client at the top, they'll get a main contractor, get some series of subcontractors, who then get subcontractors. Eventually you get down to the tradespeople who are actually doing the work, who have to go and buy the material and buy the labor and hire the equipment. And they're at the bottom of this supply chain, really like financially carrying the project. And then once they've done their work, they've got to submit an invoice that goes up one level, and then there's a 90-day period and goes up, and eventually the payment comes down. So some of those people at the bottom of the supply chain who are really carrying the projects are waiting 90 to 120 days to get paid. And everybody else in between is really just skimming off for a management fee. And it's all based on very slow manual procedures of contract management. And there's no reason why those things could not be incorporated into smart contracts. I mean, smart contracts are simple: if this, then that. So if you've done this and it's been approved, the payment, why shouldn't the payment be released? There's no reason other than people want to maintain control in this deep supply chain to have this outdated system. So I do see that, as I said earlier, I can't see why those things wouldn't come into play at some point. I don't know how long these things take, but it just makes so much sense from everybody's point of view. Well, particularly the people that are really doing the work, the people who are buying the material, buying the labor, hiring the equipment. The people at the cold face, if you like, of work that are carrying everybody else. There's no reason why they shouldn't get paid for their jobs.
We don't know either how soon it'll roll out, but as soon as the cost savings are realized and the technology is ready for mass adoption, I think every company is going to make a quick switch or as fast as they can to get over to the new technology, because you're removing a lot of that risk. There's money to be realized there. These intermediaries are removed, and there's
Well,
it's a lot of
again,
money.
I think you'll have a lot of pushback from the intermediaries. Like they would, that's
But
their business
they're
model.
intermediaries. So if we think of it as
Yeah,
sort of
but
hierarchical, then
they well, I'm sorry, I'm just being provocative, but there's there's large engineering companies and project management companies and general contracting companies. That's all they do. Their whole business. They don't actually build anything. Like this, if you look at some of the biggest contracting companies in the world, they don't actually build anything. They're just managing. They're just performing an intermediary role between being able to win the main contract and subdivide it and push it down to other people. So now there's still there's an important management function there, but I suppose people will begin to question, should so much money go to the person who's not actually doing the work, with so little going to the person who's actually doing the work? Um, Particularly when the whole flow is transparent and everybody's seeing, oh, you got 10%, and
yeah.
all you did was get the contract and push it on, and I'm only getting 5%, and I'm doing all the work. Something's wrong here.
What are your
Um,
thoughts then on AI agents that could start to replace some of these managerial roles? Do you think that's bound to happen?
I think it'll definitely help. I mean, AI is a fantastic um, helper, but it's not. I mean, I think we've all experienced that AI is not perfect by itself,
Mm-hmm.
and particularly when you come into critical roles, like just trying to think of an example, but like ultimately somebody has to take responsibility when a fire kills 70 people. Somebody has to go to court
Right.
to answer, and AI is not going to go to court. So somebody at the end of the day has to take responsibility for decisions. And now the AI will definitely help that person to process through lots of information and get down to what's critical. But I suppose they have to make a judgment as to uh, how good is the AI, you know, the answer that it's giving me. And I think AI by itself can be terribly wrong if you give it the wrong information. It's like garbage in, garbage out,
Right.
you know. And so I think responsible people, professional people, will want to know what went in and what's coming out, and they'll want to be comfortable with that because ultimately, if they're signing their name to it, um, so it's going to definitely help in the productivity and processing lots of information, but it won't completely replace professionals because somebody still has to go to court at the end of the day and
Mm-hmm.
take responsibility.
That makes sense.
So it will It's definitely reduce the numbers. I think you can see that in the practice of law. I mean, law firms used to have like two or three floors of people who would just be doing manual research into case studies to support the partner, the law firm, when they went to court. Like a lot of that manual research is being done through AI, but still the partner going to court. Maybe one day an AI will go to. I don't know. We'll see.
So if I were to interpret your response, because one of the questions or one direction I wanted to take that question was the balance between technology and professional expertise. To me, it sounds like a lot of the lower level responsibilities can be replaced by AI and then, or junior responsibilities. And then this gives people the opportunity to do what people do best, which is specialization and the human component, the human element, and as
Yeah,
opposed to the mundane tasks.
absolutely. I think we actually we did a very interesting program this year in the BIM Heroes community on thinking skills, because last year the World Economic Forum looked at all the skills that were going to be needed in the next 3 or 4 years, and all the human skills like thinking skills, like critical thinking, design thinking, systems thinking. Like AI can't think. I mean, AI can process
Mm-hmm.
uh, information that it's given, but it's not thinking. It's not creating. And so AI is definitely going to replace sort of those mundane, procedural, repetitive tasks that humans are involved in. And to be honest, like as an architect and a professional, like I don't want to be involved in sort of mundane, procedural, boring, repetitive tasks. Like there's nothing interesting about that.
Right,
you know,
right.
like you want to be involved in the creative problem solving, um, you know, and challenges. And that AI is not really good at that. It's not really good at problem solving. It, if it had the solution to the problem already, then yes, it could regurgitate it. But coming up with the solution is, I think, where the human mind is fascinating. So I'm all for getting rid of mundane, repetitive, laborious, mind-numbing procedural tasks. I think computers are fantastic for that because they can do it 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, no sick days,
Right.
no my kid had a flu today days or hangover days or anything. Like it's just keeps going, and
Mm-hmm.
like that's what we need. We need that productivity shift. Um, and we have an enormous problem in our sector. Like we can't deliver enough infrastructure for the world. So it's not about humans being replaced. We don't have enough skilled people to deliver the housing, the schools, the hospitals, the roads, the electricity infrastructure, the communication infrastructure, what that the world needs. It's like we just can't do it. And the way we do it is so slow and expensive now that most people can't afford it. Um, so like everybody can have an iPhone, but not everybody can have a house to stay in because it's just too slow and too expensive. So we definitely need to leverage the technologies that are available to us. Let the technology do what it's good at, and let humans focus on what they're good at. And the combination of technology and human creativity is what will solve world problems, you know, in all our sectors. So I'm all for it, but it's not going to. I don't see it replacing uh, responsibility. AI is not going to take responsibility.
Mm.
If you said to OpenAI, would you stand over the response I get from your ChatGPT if I ended up in court? They'd probably say, no, you're on your own, buddy.
Very interesting. Well, as we wrap up here, I want to touch on, what you've co-founded so far. So ArcDox, BIM Heroes, and the BIM Coordinators Summit. What was the background leading up to this? You felt the call to co-found these, and how's it been going?
Well, the ArcDox is 15 years in the making. So the driver behind that was to really be at the forefront of this digital transformation of our sector from analog processing to digital processing, and to work with clients and architects and engineers who are interested in that. So that's pretty much what we're doing as a consultancy company, um, working on fantastic projects with amazing people. But I suppose we felt it just wasn't scaling quick enough. The information, the transition was taking so long. I mean, if you'd asked me 15 years ago, how long would it take our industry to move from this old school traditional process to this amazing technologically based process, I would have said, oh, maybe 5 years,
Hmm.
but it hasn't been. It's been 15 years and it's been so slow. And there's still people today that are sort of opposed to using these technologies, which is incredible to me. So we wanted to scale beyond Ireland into the global market, get this message out. We wanted to go beyond architects and engineers. We wanted to involve people like you in the discussion, people who are interested in real estate, in finance, in legal issues, in, like the broader sector, because when you spoke about BIM to most people, they would say, well, that's got nothing to do with me. I'm not an architect. I'm not an engineer. But actually, it's got everything to do with you. Like at you, as a person who's interested in property, property doesn't exist without BIM, like without information.
Right.
We've
Hmm.
already discussed that. So, and the information in its digital format, structured digital format, is so useful and so valuable to the property, to the physical property, that it's definitely a core interest. But so we wanted to get that conversation going, yeah, at a broader level. And so we started this community. It actually started during COVID, so just while everybody was taking a break, and we started these online sessions to try and educate, or say, normal people who didn't normally consider themselves part of the BIM world, and that just grew, and it's grown now. We have a fantastic following on LinkedIn. I think we've got about 44,000 people from 120 countries. We have a platform which we created where people can discuss these ideas. So we have about 9,000 people there. And yeah, it's just about creating a global conversation about better ways of working. And at a very broad level, everything. Like we want to discuss finance, we want to discuss contracts, we want to discuss blockchain, we want to discuss, all these things, how they come together and make a more productive industry, more sustainable industry, more equitable industry. And that way we feel we can make an impact on the world, because everybody in the world is affected by the built environment. Like, it's where you live, it's where your kids go to school, it's where you get cared for, it's where you do shopping, it's where, like, there's nothing about your life that doesn't involve the built environment. And
Right.
there's nothing about anybody's life. And so we want to make a better built environment through technology adoption. That's what we're trying to
Well said. I mean, I say those things too. The
do.
built world is everything. It is our world. We need to think about it. We need to consider it. We need to make it efficient, sustainable, welcoming, all
Yeah,
those different elements. Because right now, built world is generally driven by profits, and that can come at the expense of people. So we want to avoid that for sure,
yeah. And people should have profits, like you shouldn't,
but not at the expense
but
of.
there's a lot of waste. So
Mm,
I suppose what we're trying to do is let people keep their profit, but eliminate the waste. The
right.
inefficiencies, the
Hmm.
unproductive, like even environmentally, the built environment is responsible for 40% of the CO2 emissions, like 40% of energy use, 20 to 30% of all raw material use. It's like it's not a it's not a great example, like and we're all, as we're all involved in it. So, but it's so critical to everything we do. Even this conversation we're having, if you think about it, wouldn't happen without the built environment, because the telecommunication infrastructure that is supporting this call, and you're in America, I'm in Ireland, um, wouldn't happen without building, the infrastructure. So I really can't think of anything that doesn't involve the built environment. So we just need to make it better, because at the moment it's one of the least digitized sectors. I think fishing is worse. Well, it's probably just like fishing uses a lot of technology like radars to, so you don't. Not that we want to compete for the last place. So I think we can do better, and the industry can be more exciting. I think a lot of young people probably don't see the built industry as a sort of exciting industry to go into. They want to go into gaming and computers or whatever, but there's nothing more real than the built environment. So, and if we can use all these technologies like gaming, computers, and whatever to improve the built environment, then hey, we solve a lot of problems.
And then the BIM Coordinators Summit. How did that go in 2024? And what can we look forward to in 2025?
Yeah, so the BIM Coordinators Summit is, I always tell people, it's like the Christmas party when the BIM heroes come together. It's in 2024, we had 3 events. We had a virtual event in the Middle East, we had a virtual event in the LATAM region, and a physical event in Europe. And yeah, it was fantastic that the community is growing in all these areas. In 2025, we're looking to extend that into 6 regions of the world. Most of them will be virtual events, but we'll still have a live event in Europe. Europe is still our biggest following, and of course we have to respond to where the following is. So, but we're encouraging communities to grow in each country, and so we've set up working groups across all the regions, and we're hoping that the community will grow, and eventually our ultimate goal is to have these parties in 5 regions of the world every year. But they're really important opportunities for people to meet up in person, shake hands, and enjoy each other's company, and talk about these amazing things that we talk about in person. But if you can't make it in person, then we have the next best thing, which is virtual events.
Awesome. Well, I'll have the BIM Coordinator Summit link in the show notes along with ArcDox. And would you say LinkedIn and X are the best ways to get in touch with you?
LinkedIn's our best platform for reaching us. And then we have our own BIM Heroes platform. So bimhero.ie, so bimhero.io. And that's really where we're getting down to the discussions. So LinkedIn's nice for sort of touching base and promoting, but BIM Heroes is where people are getting into the meat and potatoes of how do we make this happen. And it's fascinating, the range, the diversity of people from different countries, different disciplines, contributing to this knowledge base of the community. And of course, it's also a great place to meet people, to do business. So it's, as I said, we have 8,000 or 9,000 people there who are really interested in this. And if you want to do business with people, those are the people you want to do business with, because you don't have to convince them
right,
that digital is the way to go. They convinced.
Absolutely. Well, anyone who wants to get into BIM or the digitization of real estate, I mean, Ralph, you're the guy to talk to. BIM Heroes, that's the community to join. BIM Coordinator Summit, that's the place to be. What you got to attend. So I'm going to have all of those links. I definitely encourage people to participate, because that's what's going to move the industry forward: education, conversation, and then application. So, Ralph, I mean, it's been a wonderful conversation. You have so much wisdom and knowledge within you, and I mean, you're an educator. You put that in your description, and I think it's so accurate, because you've done a marvelous job of helping people learn and grow and put that into use and move the industry forward.
Absolutely. There's no growth without learning something. So it's like communicating information, which is what education is it's critical to growth and progress. Like you can't hold on to, if you just hold on to information, it doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't do anything. You actually have to put it into action, put it out there. So great to talk to you. I'm sure we'll have many more conversations. Hope we can have a real face-to-face beer together one day, and
Absolutely.
we'll
Absolutely.
change the world. The
Yes.
physical world.
Yes, I hope to make it to Ireland for sure.
Yeah.
I haven't done too much in Europe. Alrighty, Ralph. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
And
Thanks.
hopefully we'll have you on in the future.
And have a great day.
You too.